Today, I think that maybe we're not going to break up into small groups, but instead I'm just going to kind of walk us through where we've been in our discussions about transdisciplinary research, and then talk a little bit about this concept of convergence. Irene was just sharing with me that she was at a conference recently that talked about convergent research design, and noted that there were a lot of different ways of thinking about convergent research. And that's what I'm finding as I dive into this literature myself. So I'm going to share with you kind of what I have found so far, focusing mostly also on kind of what NSF is thinking. And then maybe we can have a conversation about it, and then think about within the context of our current thinking about the research collaborative. So it's kind of where we're headed right now. Any questions about that before I start sharing my screen? Okay. I'm off. And Irene, I'll leave it to you to start letting people into the chat. Okay. So just as by way of review, here's where we've been so far in our thinking about, this isn't the format I want to be in. Is it? No. Oh, I flipped my screen. My screen's flipped. You guys.
We've got your presentation view.
Oh,
you just gave away the punchline.
Darn it. I don't want you guys to see my sneaky stuff. Stop sharing. All right, screen share. All right. How's that?
Same.
Really? I shouldn't be allowed to use technology in any way. That's just the answer. Is just that.
I think in your upper left, there's like two little arrows doing this. I think maybe if you click on that. Yeah.
Mark Stone.
Well, I'm here.
About you. All right. So this is just review of our thinking about transdisciplinary research design. Very familiar with where we're at, thinking about real world problems, thinking about co-creating both the design of the research questions that we're asking, and then also the production of the actual research itself. And then also recognizing that there are lots of different ways of producing knowledge, that the scientific method is not the only way of producing knowledge, and that in our case, especially with having sort of a rich background of different ways of knowing and different Native communities in our basin, that there's a lot of history to draw upon, a lot of living knowledge to draw upon from different ways of being. Last we had a small but scrappy group last time talking about a very specific type of transdisciplinary research that comes from this particular scholar, Niclosio. How do I pronounce this? Someone help me. Who's my Frenchie? Come on, someone. Niclosoian school? Is that gonna work? Can I get away with that? Toddy Steelman's school. Let's just give it to Toddy for now. That we read her paper in her work up with First Nations in Canada, talking about a type of transdisciplinary research that actually very specifically moves into a third space that is respectful, safe, unfiltered, creative, and embraces not just other objective ways of knowing. So from an epistemological perspective, also embraces subjective ways of knowing. And I have down here, this is my own kind of spin on this, think quantum. So think of the influencer, the observer influencing the observed. So one way of thinking, I think, about maybe transdisciplinary methodologies would be, how would you do methodology if you took quantum physics seriously, right? In which you cannot engage in an experiment without being a part of the experiment yourself, and which there's a relational element, to an ongoing and dynamic and relational element to the research. And so there's kind of a destabilization of privilege within that context. It's kind of exciting. Also within the human and the non-human, I think within that maybe we could bring, that would be kind of an interesting element to play with in our system. To quote Toddy Steelman's paper, the subjective and the objective are held within a larger umbrella of meaning. And this figure, the hidden third, is a concept within Nicolas So, and this figure I thought was a very, very familiar to our Zia symbol, but this is actually a figure from their paper in which they posit subjective experience, objective experience, and then Western science and indigenous knowledge. And they're playing with all of these, and then created a different art spaces in which communities and researchers could work together to build safe spaces for creative sharing of learning about place. Okay. So this figure I just wanted to share came from a paper that I'm just getting into now from Peak et al. That came out of a conversation we're having as part of the NSF research team that we're working on for this network, and that's kind of related to the work in the that we have going, that we're just starting here in our collaborative, and it kind of puts transdisciplinary on this linear trajectory. And what's kind of helpful just about this particular figure is that I don't really tend to fall into this idea of wanting to put it on a progressive, teleological trajectory, but you can see that there is on some level an increasing way in which there's just more and more integration as you move into transdisciplinarity. And with transdisciplinary, you have not just interdisciplinary teams, but also new paradigms and new sets of partners, an ever broadening set of who's at the table in terms of creating what you're doing and being a part of what's going on. So translating that into how NSF is thinking about this, this is how NSF is defining transdisciplinary, convergent research. And they, as you can see at the end, say that of all the different types of interdisciplinary research, transdisciplinary is the closest to convergent research. So they're saying they're not quite the same, but they're kind of closely related. And they define convergence as something that is a means of solving vexing research problems, particularly complex problems, focusing on societal needs. So there's a lot of similarity with transdisciplinary there. Integrating knowledge, methods, and expertise from different disciplines. And I underlined novel frameworks, because I think that's a key element here, some novelty. And catalyzing scientific discovery and innovation. So, and this is just another basically reframing of that same statement. So I guess one question is sort of, is this us? In 2016, NSF really came out with growing convergent research as one of its 10 big ideas for new investments in science and engineering. And the paper that I gave you that had that trajectory of integration, it recognizes that for the most part, a lot of the work to date in Convergence really has been in that science and technology fields. You know, it has been in that bioengineering, medical, technology. But they also raise this point, and actually there's a National Research Council paper that also raises this point, that there's the potential and the need to really reintegrate the social sciences. And the paper that's cited does a really nice job of saying, hey, guess what? If you don't integrate the sciences, you run the risk of just creating these technological fixes. And human history has this way of showing us that we don't do such a great job when that's all we're focusing on, is these technological fixes, and not looking at the human side, of the why, and the context in which these technologies are, being employed, deployed, created, the overall nature and history and all these other types of things in which these are happening. So so this is also a direct quote from an NSF website. Research teams practicing convergence aim at developing ongoing productive relationships that nurture collaboration. Yay, that's what we want to do. And also develop novel ways of framing related research questions and open new research vistas. So my question to you guys is this us? Are we going to be convergent? And this is the point which I kind of want to open it up to discussion. And I want to just share this last slide, which is I attended a talk by one of the candidates for vice president for research here at UNM, Colleen Fitzgerald. She created this figure based on a convergent research design funded project in the New Arctic. She reformatted the New Arctic's graphic for what she would do in New Mexico around for the Grand Challenge in water. So she took out basically Arctic and put in water for New Mexico. And this is what, for her, transdisciplinary convergent approach to water research might look like here. So I thought that would be maybe an interesting thing to take a peek at as we think about it. Obviously, we are a part of that Grand Challenge, maybe a subset of that kind of element. But I think this, for me, this question of novelty is an interesting one. This pressure always to be novel, people. What's up with that? And then grand new vistas. So I'll stop with there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I can always bring this back up if people want to see something. But I think at this point, it might be more helpful to see each other. So hopefully you guys can see each other now again. Can we all see each other now? No? Oh, no. Right. What did I do? There we go. All right. Now, let's hear from people.
I can crack the ice that I think aspirationally, that is where we should be putting our Vista, but I don't know if I don't think we're there yet. I'm not sure what the grand new Vista is, and I don't think we're like
new research vistas.
We need our new Vista, and also like the novel methods component, etc. I think we're talking about them and trying to figure out what that might look like, but I don't think we're at it yet. But based on our many conversations that all around the Zoom room here, I think we have to. It's the only way we're going to get out of the status quo and try to get to something that's more functional than what we have right now.
Yeah.
Do you think that smashing existing frameworks together counts as a novel framework? Because that's my preferred approach with these kinds of problems.
Yeah, and I think in the NSF view of this, I think so. I think combining existing tools into a new mashed up tool is novel. Yeah.
Because that, I think, opens up the convergence immediately if you're taking social science frameworks and combining them with more natural science frameworks. You're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm. It does. Maybe we should back up a little. What is novelty? You know, I mean, I think when I think about novelty, I think about novelty in the context of novelty ecosystems. You know, there's their literature and novelty ecosystems, and in that literature, a novel ecosystem is one that, you know, functions as an ecosystem, you know, but it doesn't bear any resemblance to anything endemic or historical. So it's kind of this unique, weird thing that has internal structure to it. It has self-organization. It functions. It's an ecosystem. But it's unique. It doesn't bear a resemblance to the past. I don't know if that helps at all, but that's what I think about when I think about something being novel.
I think research methods are more like pop music, though. Like, it's all been done. You got the same basic instruments, and now you're just finding new ways to combine things. Like, there's not a lot of just broad new sweeping methods that come out in any field. Right?
I think we're talking about the same thing, though. It's kind of because the same thing's true in ecology, right? I mean, we have the same old critters. Mm-hmm. You know, we're riffing. You know, we're riffing that we're putting these bands together in new mm-hmm. combinations. Mm-hmm. Who do we have on the phone?
That's me, Kathy Cambeck.
Kathy, chime in, please.
Well, just recently in the past couple of years at the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture, this has kind of become a much bigger thing. And there are some papers on novel methods that I'm going to try and find and share with everybody. But the way people have been thinking about novel methods in my discipline is this idea of, well, there's sort of two things. One is the idea of embodiment in not a new way, but in maybe a more invested, data-oriented way, where a person might go out and try to measure an aspect of a site, for instance, in a way that's unusual. So there's a sense of finding an object or using a way of moving or recording that's unusual that would allow you to see sort of the invisible elements of a site. And that's something that I have been trying to work with some of my students to do. There's another one, another version of this novel methods where people go and say, actually play with time scales a little bit and trespass and intervention in a way that's novel. So for instance, there was a really interesting project done recently where another academic was actually planting grass seed on abandoned sites and doing it in a very logical way where there would be like certain diameters of these circles. They knew which grass seed they were planting where, and they kind of mapped that, but they also watched the way that and recorded through photography as well, like the effects of this, or rather the results of this growth and kind of the way it affected community as well. So it wasn't just whether the grass grew or not, but it's how the people around that place interacted with the grass. So I think novel methods in landscape architecture, it's still, I think, more of just getting out of okay, we're going to see what the topography is, and we're going to understand the soil profile, and we're going to see what the surrounding buildings are like, and really trying to get at those things that make sites really dynamic and amazing, and kind of capturing, in a sense, like the beauty of the place, but trying to do it in a way that's I guess sort of quantifiable or repeatable in a sense. So I don't know if that really helps with this definition, but I will find, there was one really good paper that I've read that I'll find and I'll share with you once I get it.
Great. Thank you. Other thoughts?
I'll share that I'm a little concerned I'm going to get kicked out of this group because I've realized that my primary interest with this new Center for Community Geography that we just launched really is focused on community needs and to the exclusion, I think, of scientific discovery or innovation or publication at this point in terms of our starting point. So I'm not saying I'm not being a scholar and wanting to, you know, work toward developing new knowledge, but I'm just kind of wondering how to integrate, you know, a more community-based starting point with kind of the broader imperative that we all have as academics to publish and produce new knowledge.
Well, let me say a couple things about that. One is, you know, one of the things that Barb is going to kick in on later is what's needed to participate in this collaborative, and it's different for different people. So, you know, for you, part of it is, you know, potentially like, okay, I want to be feeding this new center, you know, which we need to give you some airtime too, maybe next semester to talk about what the center could offer and how we can synergize with that. But, you know, this is just NSF I mean, what I love about this collaborative that we're putting together is we don't need no stinking NSF to do what we need to do, because this is in our backyard. You know, we can do things on a shoestring, potentially, a lot of it. You know, this is, I mean, I'm very interested in doing things that are NSF relevant. I do think there are going to be some NSF related products coming out of this. Already, Mark and I, you know, and some members of this group are working on an NSF related project that's going to be related, you know, to this, but not every product's going to be related to this. You know, that's what I love about the idea of this collaborative, is that we have this really nice spin-off where some things are going to be, you know, not, you know, don't have to fit that mold, you know, and I think that, you know, today we're talking about this particular mold. And if I was shaking my head when you said that, because I think what I was actually just right before you know, began to talk, I was thinking about things that I do not see in the Convergent research literature. One thing I don't see is history, you know, and any kind of archival, you know, kind of contextualization kind of work, which is a piece of that, you know, you're doomed to repeat the history kind of caution that's in the paper that I just read, and art, you know, which is also in the Steelman paper. So I think that there's actually something that we would potentially create that's a lot more complex, you know, in its nature than as a collaborative. You know, that's missing from the current convergence literature. I'm not saying that it's necessarily something that NSF would easily sign up for, because I think it's hard for them. They say they want a certain thing, but it's still hard for them not to want to fund something that is going to, like, you know, drive the next thing, you know, but that's so, but as a, you know, as a scholar on your own merits, I do think that throwing in someone with your, you know, your historical geography elements of into the watershed would be huge, potentially, into a convergent research design. Other thoughts?
I'm getting into this process of actually trying to characterize different social ecological systems, or specifically water resource systems. And really dovetails nicely with this conversation in my mind, because it's so immediately obvious to me that when you try and characterize a water resource system, that you can't rely on any one discipline, and that it also requires dialogue with communities. And so I find that the mission of characterizing a system and then also developing indicators of what it's doing and how to monitor how it's doing is a really obvious focal point for this type of research that then brings in other NSF priorities, like potentially like harnessing the data revolution to try and come up with things like indicators. And so obviously I selfishly want this research to help me, in that process, but I also think there's a lot of obvious applications and ways to bring people together to make things like that happen.
Yeah. I'm gonna throw, because Jamie's on the call. She and I met separately, and I'm gonna make it related to this conversation. It does relate to this conversation. One thing that we met about is, you guys will remember when Colin was giving his presentation on the Rio Grande Water Fund, he talked about how the history of how these funds were created was actually in Latin America. Nature Conservancy models in Latin America were often sort of single payer driven models for water fund projects. And one of the potential things that this collaborative could do, I think, is do some comparative work, trying to learn from what other.
Sorry. I'm mute for a second, and then
my dogs are feeding back off of yours.
to go into. And well, I was on a call the other day where someone said, this is Zoom has created opportunity for dogs across the world to like connect to one another in new ways. That there's a comparative piece to the research collaborative that could also be built on kind of looking into the work that has happened with these other water funds. And we have partners in Latin America that we already have in place that could potentially help work with us to take on some of, at least one or two that we already have in mind, to maybe put together a proposal to do something. And Jamie has some background in some of those areas too. Just thinking about one element of something this collaborative could sort of take on.
I don't know that I have anything to add, but I've sort of looked into those a little bit. I mean, not a whole lot more than our conversation, but it seems like, I mean, they seem to be pretty different, but I think that there could be some really interesting comparisons. So that could be, I don't know if that's work that would fit as, novel in this bigger discussion of the NSF, but I'm interested in that.
I'm also super interested in that. I think that's a really cool idea. Just because kind of looking at the frameworks from which the research itself is proceeding is, I think, a really rich starting point as well.
Irene, do you have anything you want to add based on what you were hearing at the conference you were at in terms of how people were characterizing convergent research? How does that compare to how I was just characterizing it or how we've been discussing it?
So it's kind of interesting because I was looking back at my notes. Let me get the name so I don't butcher it. It's the International Network for the Science of Team Science. And so they have an annual conference every June. And it was actually a workshop on integration, but it kind of turned into this back and forth between convergence and integration. And some people were arguing for integration being the ultimate goal. And others were arguing for convergent research design being the ultimate goal. So it was an interesting back and forth, because in NSF terms, you have to start with integration to get to convergence, because you're creating the knowledge with integration and then convergence applies it. But a lot of people were arguing just the opposite. So it was kind of fascinating.
I think we lost Melanie. Now we got her back. Okay.
Mark, how relevant do you think the sort of the big issue that we've been scratching our heads over how to write about fits into, you know, the transdisciplinary novel system that we're working in? You know, it's this issue of, we've got a novel system in the Rio Grande, right? It's the system state has changed with infrastructure, and we're trying to manage endangered species that evolved in a previous system state. And it takes adaptive governance at multiple scales to try to crack this nut, because we've been very unsuccessful as a community. And it's not just in the Middle Rio Grande, it's throughout the Western US and other places. So I guess I just, you know, it's a very transdisciplinary issue in that, you know, we're trying to think about, governments have a role at a larger scale for adaptive governance, but communities have an important role at more of a local scale in addressing issues to make the whole thing work. And this is just a kind of a instantaneous brain dump, but I just wonder if there's elements of everything that I hear folks talking about, you know, Rio Grande, at least novel ecosystem, transdisciplinarity. How would this fit within the context of what the research collaborative is trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think what we're doing with the paper that we're working on now could be characterized as convergent research from my understanding of the theory. I've only read a couple of papers on convergent research. From my understanding, I think it kind of is. The challenge there being, okay, it's a couple of people with one paper, right? That's not happening. This isn't happening frequently system-wide in a coordinated manner, versus us just putting energy into it because we see a need and we're trying to, and we see doing this kind of work as a way of addressing that need. But I think what we're doing could be, I think you could argue that it's convergent research.
Yeah, I think to really solve the problem, it would involve convergent research.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're just trying to characterize it in our paper.
But we're taking on a wicked problem. We're doing transdisciplinary work, highly integrated, with, you know, a specific outcome in mind. So I think it is a little sliver of convergent research. But to truly make progress on the problems, you're right. Like, maybe this could be one seed that grows into something at a much larger scale.
Do we have a novel research paradigm?
I think we do. That's why we can't write the damn paper.
But you know, in terms of, you know, thinking about the Latin America Water Fund that you brought up, I mean, there are examples where others have tackled similar yet a little bit different problems. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, that's why I'm kind of trying to weave together all of the different pieces that are being discussed into something that we could think about here for the Middle Rio Grande Collaborative.
Yeah, I'm interested in it. I think when I think about convergence, I think that there's a, you know, I'm trying to pick up the flavor and the tone, you know, of what they're pulling forward. I think one thing I feel like I pick up on is there's a level of intensity to the need to drive innovation and solutions, you know? So it's kind of like, we need to tackle this thing and we need to like figure this shit out, and it's gonna take new thinking, and it's going to take us to like get out of our old ways of being and like really take this shit on. And I think that like, you know, we've got this new virus on our hands, and we got to figure out how to like develop something new, package it, deliver it, live differently, you know, whatever, you know, this kinds of, maybe as an example, there's an acceleration focus to it. There's a, you know, and I think we could certainly in our system, I would, when it comes to the actual silvery minnow issues, the issues in the lower Rio Grande, I would package it as a part of the larger part of the system. And I'd be like, holy crow, you know, climate change is coming. We need to adapt. Our system is changing. We're going to be pumping ground. What I like to say is in my future scenario, we're going to be pumping water out of the ground and putting it into channels for this freaking minnow and to regenerate cottonwoods, you know, that we've been storing, you know. We're going to be using these reservoirs in ways we never thought of before. And we got to figure out how to use this built infrastructure, you know, in ways that it was never designed for in the first place, because we're not going to tear them out and we're not going to have trees anymore. So what the, you know, I mean, so that's when I start thinking about it in terms of a convergent design. And I think like, shit, we need Alex and her quantitative, you know, resilience stuff. And we need, you know, you and, you know, Laura and her ability to like help figure out what those indicators are. And then we need Maria to help us think about the historical, you know, pieces of this. And we need, you know, some social scientists in here to help us, you know what I mean? Like we did, and that's how we start packaging it together and put the intensity of it together in the framework of this holy crow science, climate adaptation. If we're going to continue to live in this basin, and we're going to continue to have some complexity and biodiversity in this basin, it's going to look really different than it used to look. That's how I, you know, that's my rant, really, to thinking about it in a convergent way. And I really think we are going to do that with the minnow. That's what I would be doing. Hi, Melanie. It's our newly re-elected representative.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
You too. Glad you I saw you jumped on and then jumped back off. So do you feel like you've got enough context to throw some wisdom at this?
I missed most of the conversation. I'm sorry.
That's all right. We're about ready to, unless anyone has anything else, I think maybe I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to throw into the chat as we start to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to throw into the chat something that came out of this paper that I mentioned. And by the way, this paper from Peak is actually from a research center that focuses on natural disasters. And I think given that wildfire is our natural disaster, it's maybe an interesting paper for us to think about as we think about, you know, collaborative. It's a regime changer for our system. It's maybe not a bad way of one lens through which we can think about the holy crow, you know, how you know, intensity driving the need for research and change in our basin. But what I just put into the chat was the things that NSF identified as what we need to foster convergence and across, and this is really no surprise to anybody, organizational cultures, institutional structures, faculty development and promotional elements, training programs, state partnerships, and sustainable funding. And this is kind of a segue, in a sense, into a conversation related to what our own needs are, both individually and at UNM, to make the to make ourselves be able to participate in this collaborative, and also to what we are going to need from what UNM is going to need to be able to be competitive in this kind of an environment. One of the things that we could do as a collaborative is be able to advocate, and this also gets to, I mean, as a group, we wear a bunch of different hats. I also wear the Director of Sustainability Studies hat. Mark wears the Resilience Institute Director hat. Irene, program person for the Interdisciplinary Co-op. Maria with the Mallory Center. All of us have capacities to, and others on the call as well, capacities to sort of go to the administrations and say, if you really want to support this kind of research, here's the kind of things that we need to make that possible. So, we can be a living experiment as a collaborative as well, as we think about, what we need to be able to flourish doing this, work, and what it really takes to be able to support team members, especially be able to keep sustained interest from people like Melanie and Todd, who are, outside the immediate wheelhouse of academia, and keep sustained interest and attention and things like that. So I wanted to throw those things on the chat as a way of maybe starting to tee up Barbara's conversation for what we're going to be doing in our last meeting together.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
As it relates to this list here. So I know Mark and you and others are working on a NSF proposal. How does this effort articulate to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's an ongoing question. Next, there are definitely research questions that are going to be asked that I think are going to come out, they're going to be articulated in the NSF proposal that Mark and I are working on, that would be natural questions that this collaborative would want to ask. But there are also a bunch of other things that are going to be in that NSF proposal that go way beyond anything this collaborative would be interested in. So I guess one way of saying it is that there's going to be a sliver of work in that larger NSF proposal that would be relevant to this collaborative. Specifically related to the Rio Grande Water Fund, which had always been my recommendation for the first kind of focus for this collaborative to start focusing on. But it was also always my recognition that this collaborative should be not just focused on necessarily one thing, that we could bring, and I think, as you mentioned, Melanie, I think one of the first things we could possibly do as a collaborative is just put together like kind of a matchmaker system, like a network identification system, where we kind of say, here are the people at UNM doing work related to the system. Here are their interests, and here are their skill sets, and then also here are the partners in this basin, and here are their needs, and here are their here are their funding opportunities, here or there, whatever, and then there are people like you almost play this broker capacity, kind of going back and forth to some extent, helping to identify those things. But we need that, and that's an ongoing need. But I think that's one of the first things that will end up coming out of this effort, some sort of attempt to keep an ongoing group of networking along those lines. But then my hope is that we will also start generating some very specific research initiatives specific to questions around the Rio Grande Water Fund. And some of those are also going to be asked as part of the NSF proposal.
Just one idea, and I don't want to throw any kind of monkey wrench into the planning that you're doing, but just, I guess, awareness raising is that there's several funders, private philanthropic funders right now, that are looking at making major investments in the Rio Grande in the next year. And I guess I would if to the extent that you guys can hold space for opportunities to potentially help support that work, because it will be basin wide and it will require sort of this kind of transdisciplinary approach. But I know like once you kind of commit to doing a project and then your time gets locked up in that, you know, that'll kind of be the thing that you're locked up in. But my hope is that hopefully funding becomes available sooner than later, and some of you all can be involved in some of that work. And it'll likely tie, I'm sure, to the state's efforts around developing a 50-year plan, the basin study, and sort of basin-wide planning efforts. So,
yeah, and I'm familiar with some of that with World Wildlife Fund and some of the other. I'm assuming some. I mean, I'm not sure exactly. I know you got a lot of irons on the fire, Melanie. I don't know all the different things you've got.
No. Oh, I didn't mean to shake my head as in, I just meant none of this is public yet, but that's why I'm putting it on your radar.
There are some, I know you got some irons in the fire. I'm curious to hear more. I'm waiting for my invitation to be included in conversations. But I can assure you that there are many of us on this call that are waiting by our phones, and we will definitely keep some bandwidth for participation. So but you know, the sooner we can be included in those conversations, the better, I guess I would say. You know, the earlier people feel comfortable including us, I would say, you know, the better, because you are right in the sense that there are only, we cannot replicate Mark Stone's, unfortunately. The cloning technology is not, if it is there, they're not allowing us to use it. And I don't know, it might not even be safe. It might be dangerous, even if it were available. We might not even want to do it. I'm not sure. It's a mixed bag. I might have to ask ourselves that question. But so anyway, it's but yeah, I'm excited about what I've heard, and you know, in various, to extent where I've heard anything. So yeah, for sure. Barb?
Just had to unmute myself. So let me just take a few minutes to first sort of relate some of the thoughts on what we'd be doing in 2 weeks on December 2nd in that gathering, and then some specifics just to let you all know what I'll be doing between now and then to help you get ready to have sort of a concrete productive meeting on the 2nd. And so with respect to today's conversation, think about this particularly for those who expressed interest in either being in the group that discusses how to do transdisciplinary research better, basically researching the research, and those who expressed interest in actually doing the transdisciplinary research, which the shorthand for that in the questions was the group that's going to be talking about co-production of knowledge. So doing research that involves people within the basin as well as academics. And those may be agency people working as managers, but they also may be citizens or nonprofits. Is that one of the ideas that a group I've worked with has had for novel approach to doing this kind of work. One of the problems you get from both from funders like NSF and also when you try to publish at a fairly high level on these things is that it's applied work, it's case studies, it's not transferable to another setting. But one of the things you know this because it's one of the reasons you're involved in this group. One of the problems is when you have a complex social ecological system undergoing change is complex systems have emergent behavior. And so the actual changes that are occurring are going to be contextual, and you're not going to understand them You're not going to learn how to deal with them, whether it's technologically or in your governance, if you're not studying it over time and place. So one of the ways we've been trying to characterize it is when you think about transferable knowledge, we're used to thinking of it in the natural sciences as, and in governance, as transferable geographically. But I think when we're talking about a system undergoing change that we want to understand deeply and work with communities, we're talking in transferability through time. And so we're committing to long-term engagement within a specific place, but the development of new ways of working with communities, new ways of management, new ways of governance, new ways of restoration, whatever it is that's going to happen with the wildfire regime that you have, new ways of managing wildfire, new ways of managing forests, but that continually build on each other and improve over time. So like adaptive governance and adaptive management, the research is iterative, but requires a long-term commitment. And so I think that kind of fits with this idea of novel frameworks and novel ways of bringing research to bear on real world problems. The questions that, and I've kind of been going back and forth. If you keep seeing me look away, it's not because I'm talking to my dog. I'm looking at the Excel spreadsheet that we made out of the response to the surveys and kind of relating it to the things that you're all talking about. And it was kind of arbitrary to divide things into 4 groups, but I based that on the conversations you already have, what it seemed like you were expressing interest in. And in keeping with the ideas that I just brought across, there's these 4 different areas. One is kind of an umbrella, would be really understanding the research that is done in the basin to improve the way that we do transdisciplinary research. And I know here at Idaho, an NSF Infuse grant was just given to do exactly that. So I know they're kind of starting to get on their radar screen that we don't do stakeholder-based, long-term stakeholder-based research well. And we don't do it long-term because our funding cycles are so short. And then within that, the majority of people expressed interest in looking at the co-production of knowledge, and that was what I expected, because that's really what you initially came together around. But then there were also the 2 groups, one on what I'm calling stakeholder responsive research, which was what Mindy was just talking about in terms of creating maybe a website and a tracking system to continue to connect needs within the basin with researchers at New Mexico, and trying to keep that going. And I think that's in part feeds into the transdisciplinary research because it meets some of the immediate needs of stakeholders, and it starts the process of developing relationships. And then the 4th category is going to be looking at education pipelines that some of you have talked about in the past. And that, again, that feeds to how do we take students and people who are sort of thinking about designing education, and how do we embed them in the basin? How do we put them in internships that are relevant to the research they're doing that is transdisciplinary? How do we help them learn how to develop relationships? And how do we set up maybe a funding system that incentivizes at least their initial return to the basin when they graduate? So what I'm going to be doing between now and December 2nd is contacting people in those 4 groups and asking you to do certain things to prepare. It won't be a lot, but look for emails from me, Barb Cousins. It'll be a Gmail account.
Sounds
Thank
great.
you.
Sounds great. And I think we still have, like I said, we're kind of down to a small group, but I think we still have a lot of people that are very interested, that are, just couldn't make this. And we also have people that are very interested that just can't make this time, that have been interested throughout, that I've been contacted by, like Ryan Webb, who's a research professor who's doing really cool snow work. I don't know how you describe it, working with snow tell sites in the basin. So we've got lots of folks that are on different edges of this. So we'll get there.
About 20 people responded to the survey, so that's
fantastic. We're over time. So any closing thoughts before we end? Thank you all so much. I will look forward to seeing you as a webinar one last time soon. Bye.